From the Bloomberg Bureau in Washington, D.C. to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, my name is Kevin Cirilli.
And from New York, I'm Taylor Riggs. Welcome to the world of balance of power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. And it is the world of balance of power, Kevin. Let's get right to the world of politics and economics now. And let's do that with Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, looks like sort of a mixed day. What do you make?
It is certainly mixed, and you could even say it's slightly jittery, even bearish at this point, because we opened with solid gains for the Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq, all-time highs there. But we have the Russell 2000 down for a third day in a row. Yesterday, retreating from a record high, so a bearish reversal, a bit of a concern on the close. And lo and behold, we have the Russell 2000 really underperforming today, Taylor, down 1.7%. So at this point, the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq have been fluctuating between very small gains and losses. So again, a jittery tone, and the fact that you do have the Russell 2000 down for 3 days. This is the first 3-day losing streak for small cap going back to October. It's also the worst 3-day slide going back to October. This, of course, this area has been on such a hot streak, not just out of the March lows, where it is more than a double, outpacing the Nasdaq 100, but this quarter alone adding more than 40%. So this just tells you some investors are getting a little bit nervous, taking profits no matter where they bought it, and maybe preparing for a cooler January, especially considering that this index is so overextended.
All right, thanks, Abigail. And we are awaiting Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Taylor, in order to provide some type of update with regards to whether or not the Senate will take up that $2,000 stimulus check vote that passed with more than two-thirds of majority from the House of Representatives last evening here in Washington, D.C. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton for more on the Senate, particularly on how Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell plans to navigate through this. What do we know, Anna?
So we are waiting to hear from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, like you said, and we haven't really heard from him yet on how he plans to handle this House bill that was passed last night that would increase the $600 indirect payments in the current bill, the bill that just became law, to the $2,000 that Trump has requested. So this is a big moment for McConnell. We'll see how he kind of navigates this difficult position that Trump has put him in.
In addition to that, we also haven't heard from Leader McConnell with regards to the defense authorization bill. Now, it's widely anticipated that there are enough votes to override President Trump's veto. What do we know about how McConnell's political orbit has been navigating what would become the first time that Congress has overridden President Trump's veto?
Yeah, this is something that Mitch McConnell and his fellow Senate Republicans just see as something they have to do. Consequences be damned. I mean, they see this National Defense Authorization Act as a must-pass bill. You know, it increases hazard pay for troops. It has more than $700 billion in defense spending that needs to be authorized, or it won't happen in fiscal year 2021. So this is the kind of thing where they say, thank you, Mr. President, for making this symbolic stand. We're going to go ahead and override your veto. However, it is a very important moment because this is the first veto override that the Republican-led Senate has authorized. So, definitely another point of tension between Trump and congressional Republicans.
It's so incredibly delicate, the items left on the to-do list for Congress right now, in addition to, of course, first and foremost, this delicate balance vote between Republicans who are concerned about the $27 trillion national debt and increasingly more moderate centrist Republicans who are on board with the $2,000 stimulus checks. In addition to the defense authorization, you also have January 6th in terms of the certification deadline for the Electoral College votes, also now boiling over within the far right of the Republican Party. How has Leader McConnell forecasted he will deal with that, Anna?
Yeah, he's actually asked his Senate Republicans not to join House Republicans in this kind of pointless quest from the president to try to overturn the results of the election. And the reason why is because it puts Senate Republicans in a really difficult position. They either have to go against the Constitution or go against the president. So, it's really a no-win situation that Trump has put them in. And the fact that President Trump continues to kind of create these situations almost as if it were retribution for Mitch McConnell accepting the results of the election. It doesn't really bode well for Republican unity going forward, and also for the Georgia runoff races that will happen on January 5th.
You know, it really is incredibly fascinating to watch just how Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, what could be really the biggest unknown for his political future in the next week or so, Taylor, with regards to the Georgia runoff, as Anna just mentioned. And Taylor, I got to be honest here, Leader McConnell is known in Washington, as Anna knows, as keeping all of his political cards close to vest. No one knows whether or not there is going to be a vote for these $2,000 stimulus checks, Taylor.
Yeah, you know, Kevin, I think that's a great point. Let me just do one final question here to Anna, and we do know that we'll bring you back when we do hear from Mitch McConnell. In the meantime, though, Anna, what is the relationship right now between the president and the Senate?
It's been better. Right now, it's not great because President Trump is still stewing over all of the Senate Republicans who have recognized Joe Biden as the winner of November's election. And we saw the president had two tweets this morning criticizing Senate Republicans and saying that, they have weak, quote unquote, leaders, that they need to be stronger, or we need to elect leaders who are more strong. And of course, by strong, he means loyal to him. So, this is not a good place for an outgoing president to be, especially one who still has considerable sway over Republican voters. He could create considerable headaches for Republican elected officials, even when he's no longer in office.
Thank you, as always, Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton. And make sure to stay with us because we do want to keep you when we hear from Mitch McConnell. In the meantime, I want to turn to the virus. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the U.S. government's top infectious disease doctor, sounding the alarm over vaccination levels here in the U.S.
We certainly are not at the numbers that we wanted to be at the end of December. You heard talking about 40 million doses for 20 million people. I mean, even if you undercount, 2 million is an undercount. How much undercount could it be? So we are below where we want to be.
Dr. Fauci also expressing concern over a possible virus surge in January. For more on the path forward, I want to bring in Bloomberg medical science and tech reporter Michelle Cortez. Michelle, are we undercounting? Are we not where we need to be?
Well, we are undercounting. There's no doubt about it. We've seen that across all of the different types of products that have rolled out for coronavirus. We don't have a really great number of tests. We don't have a great number of masks and PPE. Even things like the number of cases. You see the COVID tracking project is being done by, a constellation of journalists. We see what's happening at Johns Hopkins. Bloomberg has a great tracker when it comes to vaccinations, but the bottom line is you have to get that from the health officials who are on the ground.
I actually want to interrupt here because we now have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell at the podium reviewing his remarks, and we definitely want to hear from him. Let's listen in on Leader McConnell.
We'll call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Waiting some
Has
remarks.
come out
Sorry, Kevin.
No, it's okay. I just to make sure he is behind his podium, and we're carefully monitoring this to await whether or not he will announce if there will be a $2,000 stimulus checks vote. Michelle Cortez, go ahead.
So all I was saying was that we are undercounting, but as Dr. Fauci just said, when you're looking at hopefully having immunized 20 million people and you're only at 2 million, that is a heck of a shortfall, and just the undercounting is not going to be enough to account for all of it.
So is there any country, Michelle, that you think in Europe, for example, that has successfully executed the vaccination rollout compared to the United States, or is this something that countries around the world are having to deal with?
Well, it's absolutely something countries around the world are struggling with. But I tell you what we're hearing right now, early news out of Israel, they're saying that they have vaccinated 25% of their population over the age of 60. They've vaccinated about 5% of their population already across the board. Now, of course, Israel is a much, much smaller country than the United States and the continent of Europe, of course. But they definitely hit the ground running. They're thinking that
Michelle, we do want to cut you off again. My apologies. We are hearing from the Speaker, Mitch McConnell. Let's listen in.
For this chamber to follow suit. Soon this important legislation will be passed into law. President Trump has rightly noted that this year's defense bill does not contain every provision that we Republicans would have wanted. I'm confident our Democratic colleagues feel the same way. But that is the case every year. And yet for 59 consecutive years and counting, Washington has put our differences aside, found common ground, and passed the annual defense bill. Not once in 6 decades has a Congress let its differences prevent it from completing this work for our national security and our men and women who wear the uniform. This year's NDAA will continue our momentum in rebuilding and modernizing our armed forces. It will authorize the personnel, equipment, tools, and training we need to reinforce the national defense strategy and to deter great power rivals like China and Russia. It will cement our advantage on the seas, on land, in the air, in cyberspace, and in space. And the bill will help us continue to recruit, retain, and support the men and women who keep us safe. It provides a pay raise for the troops, improvements for military housing, child care, and more. So, Madam President, for the brave men and women of the United States Armed Forces, failure is simply not an option. So when it's our turn in Congress to have their backs, failure is not an option either. I would urge my colleagues to support this legislation one more time when we vote tomorrow. Now, on another matter, on Sunday, President Trump signed into law another historic bipartisan rescue package. It will provide major support to American families through what we hope will be the home stretch of our fight with the coronavirus. Congressional Republicans, Congressional Democrats, and President Trump's senior team had all worked together to pass hundreds of billions more dollars in urgent assistance to the people who need it most. This new law will set up a targeted second round of paycheck protection to save jobs. It will renew and continue federal programs that have helped laid-off workers endure the crisis. It will send more cash to households. It will invest billions in vaccine distribution so the success of Operation Warp Speed kills the pandemic as fast as possible, and much more. This bipartisan compromise was our shot at getting help to working families on the urgent timeline that they need. Once again, I want to applaud President Trump for signing the bill and getting this much-needed assistance into the pipeline. During this process, the President highlighted 3 additional issues of national significance which he would like to see Congress tackle together. First, as he explained, the President would like further direct financial support for American households. Second is the growing willingness on both sides of the aisle to at least re-examine the special legal protections afforded to technology companies under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, including the ways it benefits some of the most prosperous, most powerful big tech firms. And the third subject, since every American, regardless of their politics, should feel the integrity of our democracy is beyond reproach, is exploring further ways to protect the sanctity of America's ballots while continuing to respect the federal government's limited role in standing behind state and local government who actually run elections. Those are the 3 important subjects the President has linked together. This week, the Senate will begin a process to bring these 3 priorities into focus. I move to proceed to calendar number 480, S3985.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to S3985, a bill to improve and reform policing practices, accountability, and transparency.
To Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell making remarks on the Senate floor. He is urging lawmakers to back overriding President Trump's defense authorization veto. This would be the first time that Congress has overridden a veto. It is a largely expected move on behalf of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He says that that vote will happen tomorrow. He also said that this week, the issues pertaining to $2,000 stimulus checks to American households, as well as Section 230, the concerns that the president has raised will come into focus, Taylor. So unclear whether or not that means there will be a vote, but saying that that will come into focus this week, Taylor.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. We were all waiting to see if there would be those $2,000 stimulus checks or if it remains as is at the $600, and not getting any further clarity on that, Kevin. So I'm with you. I think coming in focus is a way of not addressing the issue today, though we will continue to remain focused on it as the Senate is. So make sure to stay with us. We'll be following that as more news crosses And coming up, how concerned should tech companies be about China's crackdown? Donald Straszheim of Evercore, he joins us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, within the markets, China tech companies all back in focus. This after Beijing signaled a major change in its posture towards Alibaba and its affiliate Alipay, investigating Alibaba for monopolistic practices. Joining us now, Donald Straszheim, head of China research at Evercore. Always great to have you. And I am curious if this is, again, the risks that we all knew that investors are now aware of the risk of investing in China.
Well, I think everybody should continue to be, not afraid, but alert to the possibility that things can happen in China that don't happen in the same way they do in the U.S. And this is a perfect example. Beijing is acting aggressively. They put out draft regulations about this on November 10. They gave 20 days of comment period. Those are over. Now we are all just waiting for new regulations that are going to come out sometime. We don't have a timeline, but they're going to come out and they will be important.
What does this mean? I'm thinking big picture. U.S.-China trade, U.S. big tech taking on China big tech. Has the more increased influence by the Communist Party in China in their tech sector changed the game at all with how the U.S. now thinks about them?
No, I don't really think so. For a long time, China has wanted to sort of have its own tech sector separate and apart from the U.S. I think that continues to be the case. It's not going to change with the handover on January 20, the transition. And China is now very much alert that the U.S. is trying to separate itself from the tech sector in China. So their focus, it's not so much about Alibaba right now. The focus is for China to build its own tech sector with its own capabilities, separate and apart from the U.S. as a matter of self-protection, not of anything else.
Beyond the United States, is the Communist Party of China aware that their actions might actually risk driving away not just American investment, but European investment as well?
Well, I think, sure. They're aware of that. They also are aware of the risks that China now faces with the U.S. trying to separate itself from the tech sector in China. And so if they can build their own tech sector to their own satisfaction and be competitive with the U.S., this is likely to attract new investment from around the world rather than to slow it down.
Do they feel that Europe is moving toward that direction, or that in recent months that there's been the start of a new trend for Europe, particularly France, for example, to take a more hardline approach along with the United States against the Communist Party?
I don't see it really as a lot harder stance against the party in China right now. What we know is that President Trump is pounding the table on stop the China rise, hold China accountable, and so forth. And Europe is now trying to have the best of both worlds, to maintain or build a new relationship with the U.S., which was largely broken during the last 4 years. And also to be able to sell into China and to source from China without irritating Washington. That's going to be a balancing act, has been, will continue to be.
We're trying to fold in the relationship between politics here and the financial world that we do so well on Bloomberg. And reading through your latest note, it really did catch my eye that you say that we're confident Beijing has no interest in nationalizing Alibaba or anyone else except for Ant, and that is the perceived risk when it comes to financial sector stability. What do you mean by that?
Well, not nationalizing Ant. Ant, think of Baba and Ant separately. Baba is e-commerce, and Ant is financial sector. And Ant is now sort of in the crosshairs because it potentially could pose some financial sector risk in China. And we saw the run up to the potential IPO. You saw that Beijing, among others, wants to avoid any kind of financial risk in or now and on into 2021. So they're very separate. There's no interest in nationalizing these companies. State-owned enterprises in China have their role, especially in old China, not in new China, and that won't change in the future.
All right, our thanks to Donald Straszheim, head of China research at Evercore. And coming up next, we head on down to Georgia, where we'll continue to talk about the Georgia runoff elections. And remember, Bloomberg Television and Radio will have special coverage on Tuesday, January 5th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Back in the air, Boeing stock trading in the green today with the return of that 737 MAX to commercial service here in the U.S. Bloomberg's Emma Chandra has the full story. Emma, pretty exciting pictures, I have to say.
Yeah, pretty exciting pictures and pretty good for the stock too. We saw it hit a 4-week high at the highs of this session. Pared that a bit, but still solidly in the green. But it is all about that return of the 737 MAX to commercial flying in the U.S. American, the first of the airlines to return it to the skies. We know Southwest and United due to do that in the new year as well. And Boeing really seeing this as the keystone for repairing its image and its battered balance sheet. The stock's still down around 50% since it was first grounded almost 2 years ago. Revenues, if you look at the third quarter of last year, about 3.6 billion compared to that with the more than 16 billion in revenues we were seeing for the company in the fourth quarter of 2018. And it really is something that we know airlines are sort of backing the plane as well. We've seen new orders, big orders from the likes of Ryanair earlier this month. They see it as a game changer because of its fuel efficiency and increased capacity. Of course, the really important thing, Taylor, of course, is whether or not customers are going to back the flight. And American saying it's got 600 of these flights booked next month, and they're saying that customers are booking them just like they're booking any other aircraft.
Good news so far. Thank you as always, Emma Chandra. And you have the news here. McConnell blocking Schumer's vote to quickly pass those $2,000 checks. McConnell blocking the move to quickly pass those checks. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. But the news is all about your D.C., Kevin. And we are getting it that Mitch Mcconnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has indeed blocked Schumer's move to quickly pass those $2,000 checks. That is the floor of the live view of the Senate that you're looking at. And again, Senate Republicans on Tuesday blocking that attempt by Democrats to increase those direct stimulus payments from $600 to $2,000. So again, we will have to stay on this news in the next few days, as we heard from McConnell, that it will indeed be a focus in the coming days. Let's get a view on what else is going on in the rest of the world. We do that with the First Word News with Karina Mitchell.
Okay, Taylor, thank you. President-elect Joe Biden will speak in Wilmington, Delaware later today to address the slow rollout of the coronavirus vaccine by the Trump administration, and he'll outline his plan to pick up the pace. More than 2 million doses of the vaccine have been administered in the U.S. so far. That's far fewer than the 20 million the Trump administration promised would be given by the end of the year. Meanwhile, President Trump is lashing out at Republican leaders as an effort to overturn his veto of the defense policy bill. As it moves to the Senate, the House overturned it with bipartisan majorities. Trump tweeted, quote, "Weak and tired Republican leadership will allow the bad defense bill to pass. If the Senate follows suit, it will be the first time one of Trump's vetoes has been overturned." McConnell saying he will address that with the Senate this week. And the UK and the European Union will sign the treaty formalizing the post-Brexit trade agreement tomorrow. After European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen signs a document, it will be flown to London for Prime Minister Boris Johnson's signature. British lawmakers will have just one day to debate the agreement. It needs to be implemented by the time the Brexit transition period ends on December 31st. And federal officials are trying to piece together the clues to determine a motive for the Nashville Christmas Day bombing. Officials say suspected bomber Anthony Warner took steps that suggest he knew he wouldn't survive the blast, like giving away his home and his car. And a former neighbor tells AP that Warner said, quote, "Nashville and the world are never going to forget me." Just days before that blast, Warner was the only one who died in the explosion. 3 others were injured and dozens of buildings were damaged. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. Kevin.
Joining us now is Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And Adam, thanks for joining us. I want to ask you about this breaking news in which Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has now formally blocked Democrats' efforts in the Senate, to bring the $2,000 check stimulus to a vote. But it also comes at the same time that Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, the 2 Republicans up for re-election in Georgia in just a few days, have come out in support of it. This is a political maneuvering that has a lot of implications.
Absolutely, Kevin, and frankly, you're much better on some of those than I am. But I think in economic terms, what we have to focus on is we have unnecessary human suffering and a lot of uncertainty for poorer people or unemployed people because of the disruption in getting the $600 checks out the door. But the stimulus package that is going to get approved or has been approved is really one that includes some of the key aspects you need, which is extending unemployment insurance, extending it to gig workers, backing the moratoriums on evictions, giving some aid to school systems. What's missing is state and local government aid, which McConnell also blocked previously. In terms of the dynamic you talked about, it's hard to imagine. It's just like the people who've been writing commentary. Maybe if Trump had passed stimulus earlier, he would have won the election. People do seem to value a check in their hand, so it's hard to understand why McConnell is opposing it.
Adam, I want to get to some of that aid to state and local governments, but first, I want to get to something that we spoke to about Larry Summers and the actual size of those checks that you were referring to. And he said Democrats capitalizing on the rift between Senate Republicans and the president might be good politics for them, but it isn't good economics, saying that this sort of arbitrary number of 2,000 is not as targeted as it should be. Do you agree?
I disagree with Larry on this particular point, because if the choice was getting out the $600 or getting out the $2,000, and that was the choice, then obviously get the $600 out because it's more important you get it out timely, and it's more important you get the whole package out. And probably Larry agrees with that. The idea that the 2,000 is going to be that big a difference versus 600, I mean, what you'll end up doing is a lot of people will put it in their savings accounts. So you won't get maximum stimulus, but a lot of people have a lot more than $600 need. So if it goes into their savings accounts, you tax it, you'll get it back later. I don't view this as a big deal versus making sure that the stimulus we've got passed. I wish it had been even faster. If you were designing this from the start, and this is where I agree with where I think Larry was going, if you designed this from the start, you would have wanted more emphasis on needs, on state and local government, on unemployed people, on evictions. You already have some of that, but have more of that, on loans to small business, not based on giving everybody a check.
There are baby boomers who are having to act as child care centers. There are parents who have been having to pay for tutors. Definitely that $2,000 can go a long way to the middle class as well as the lower middle class. And that should be something everyone agrees on. Let me ask you this in terms of where the United States, in terms of stimulus checks, compares to other European countries. For example, how has the United States stacked up against other countries in terms of providing stimulus check relief to its citizens?
The U.S. has put out there more than most European countries and most other rich democracies, Kevin, but the gap is smaller than the top line number, because in every other rich democracy, the welfare state's much more generous. You have health insurance, you have college paid for, you have various other provisions. So this is more what the US calls discretionary spending every time Congress has to pass it. Even if you take that into account, though, the US has spent more. Then there's a debate about whether it's done more good or not, because a lot of the European countries, France, Germany, some of the others, have tied their aid much more to keeping people in their current jobs and keeping current businesses afloat. In the US, as my colleague Jason Furman has written about, it's been more disengaged. It goes to unemployed people, it goes to people who may be leaving their jobs. And there's pluses and minuses to that. So yeah, the US has spent more, but it's partly catch up because we don't have a big enough safety net. And it's definitely we've spent differently. And only over the next year or two will we see what difference that makes.
When are we going to start to care about fiscal deficits?
Not for a while.
I mean, 2022, 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
I mean, to be cynical, as many people have pointed out, obviously the Senate Republicans are going to start caring about fiscal deficits the second they lost the election. So, that sort of caring, quote unquote. There are serious people who care about deficits, and we're going to be publishing new work on that from Peterson soon. The issue is you've got to worry a lot more about the quality of what you spend it on. And that's a harder discussion to have than simply tossing around numbers. But it matters a lot. When interest rates are this low, there are a lot of things that it's worth investing in, Taylor. But then there are things that are just handouts whether or not the interest rates are low. It's just like you get a home equity loan when rates are low. You can decide whether to spend it at McDonald's or decide whether to spend it on improving your house. And you got to make those choices. And I think that's where the debate should be.
I do love French fries. I should note that I think what you touched on is incredibly important, and it's really gotten lost in the conversation over the past couple of weeks, which is that the president, in coming out and backing $2,000 stimulus checks, also wanted a reduction in what he labeled as wasteful spending. And so it wasn't just a backing of increased and more spending. It was also reducing spending in other portions of the $900 billion bill. And candidly, that's gotten way lost in the conversation over the past couple of days, in part because there was no time. Final question for you, which is the Republicans who have come out in favor, like Senators Loeffler and Perdue, if they are reelected, and in favor of these $2,000 stimulus checks, as well as the moderates in the House yesterday, is that a signal to President-elect Joe Biden's team that they might be willing to get some more stimulus in President-elect Joe Biden's first 100 days of office?
I hope so. I hope at a minimum it's a signal that they can get agreement on a real budget. Actually passing more stimulus is not quite as important as thinking about the budget and getting it through without deadlock. My fear is, I don't know about those specific Senate candidates in Georgia, but my fear is a bunch of Republicans will change their mind suddenly when Biden's in the White House and say, no, we can't spend. There should be a moderate agreement, as we saw from the moderates in the House on both parties, to building out the stimulus in a prudent fashion.
All right, well, stay with us because we're going to head from U.S. domestic policy to geopolitics with the Peterson Institute president, Adam Posen, and we'll have much more with him after the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York, and we are back with Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Adam, we had a great conversation with you in the previous section about sort of the U.S. view of things. I'd love to go global with you. Thinking about the U.S.-China relationship, particularly in recent days, China appears to be cracking down on some of their big tech, highlighting monopolistic practices, some antitrust concerns. How do you think about further intervention from the government in China tech and then the relationship then with the U.S.?
It's a really good question, Taylor, and thanks for having me for this part of the discussion. I think the Chinese crackdown has to be interpreted in a way it wouldn't have been a few years ago, that it is the reassertion of the power of the party and the state over companies. Not that that was in doubt, but obviously cracking down on Ant right before the IPO was an incredibly powerful signal. Now, like a lot of other things the Chinese Communist Party leadership does, it has an economic logic to it too. There is, just as we're seeing in the US and Europe and Japan, there is a real discussion about how you regulate and oversee these platform digital companies that may have monopolistic power, not just in terms of pricing, but in terms of diminishing innovation from others, diminishing competition, exploiting informational advantages, and frankly, financial stability issues for a company like Ant. So it's not entirely a power grab, but it does underline that you have to be very concerned about property rights in China, particularly for very large visible companies, just as it became the case for companies in Russia and just as became the case for companies in other countries with autocratic governments. And this, unfortunately, we got a little bit of a taste of that under the Trump administration as well, with them picking winners and losers in the corporate sector. So this is something generally bad.
Adam, when will we know whether or not the Communist Party of China has miscalculated whether or not this will deter foreign investment to China as a result of these actions?
It's a good question. I think it should deter some foreign investment, but you're always going to have people. There's two buckets, let's say. There's the speculative bucket, and then there's the direct investment corporate tie-up bucket. In the speculative bucket, unless the Trump administration regulations go through, people are going to want to diversify broadly into the China index, and they don't have much to fear. In terms of the deal-making bucket, though, this is a major issue. Now, you've got a bunch of financial services firms who say they're getting better access, as my colleagues at Peterson, Nick Lardy and Tianlei Huang have argued. But a bunch of people are going to have to pause. And this really has to make you worry about technology transfer. But again, what's important here is this is a domestic Chinese company that's getting slapped down. This wasn't oriented towards foreign investors, which in a sense makes it scarier.
Adam, we'd love to. Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin. We'd love to.
I was just going to say, good point.
We'd love to get your thoughts on big picture trade relations between the U.S. and China. One of the ways that we can do that is talk about currencies. This really was the first year, Adam, that I read at least two strategist notes, one being from Goldman Sachs, that there is a risk that the dollar may not be the reserve currency. They increasingly see it as maybe the yuan, not in 5 years, but this is more of a 20-year picture. Do you think that that's a risk further down the road?
I think so, but I would put it in a different way. As the economic historian Barry Eichengreen has pointed out, many others, you don't have just one reserve currency, especially nowadays. You can see many currencies where countries are able to issue debt in their own currency, borrow money in their own currency. And so, for small economies, for poor economies, no. But the question is more about how much overuse the dollar has. The dollar is incredibly overweight in global financial markets, in official reserves, in cross-border lending, in trade invoicing, considering the US doesn't do as much trade as other countries like China. And so the question is, are we going to see a down step in that overweight on China, on the US dollar? And I think, yes, for several months now, I've been arguing, I think for the first time in decades, that's realistic. But I think the beneficiary, frankly, is going to be the euro, not the yuan, because of what you all just raised, that this is not a safe place to put your money in and get your money out in China. And as long as that fear is there, I can't imagine people who are moving reserves or long-term cross-border loans or long-term trading contracts want to be in yuan. And so instead, I think there will be a step down, maybe a little bit of an increase in yuan, step down for the US and a rise in the euro share in a lot of these areas.
Let's stay in Europe for a second, because does the Biden administration strengthening ties with NATO, with European allies, how does that impact China, especially if the US and Europe are coming at this from the same approach and the same geopolitical playbook?
I think you put your finger on it, Kevin. The problem is it's not as easy to get to that approach, even though the Biden administration has professed a desire, or the incoming Biden administration has professed a desire to do so. And the key thing, which I know your colleagues have been reporting on at Bloomberg, is this idea of an EU-China investment treaty. It was very clear that the Biden administration was particularly hoping to look towards the EU and Japan and Australia to join with them on rules about cross-border tech transfers and cross-border investment. Have something like CFIUS in the US, overview and get common standards, and that could put a unified front on China. But as reported today, you've got Chinese officials saying, we're going to have this bilateral treaty with the EU, and that's going to at least partially break through the US attempts to encircle us. And you saw Jake Sullivan, the nominee for National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, actually tweet about this a week ago, saying, I hope EU thinks twice before they do this. And he had to tweet because the Biden administration types have said very clearly they're not going to meet directly with foreign officials until the inauguration, which is the right thing to do. But this was sufficiently big to the Biden team that the key national security official tweeted about it. And then the former head of NATO, the Norwegian general, whose name I forget, came out, Stoltenberg, said, listen, EU. I'm not saying the EU is wrong to do this, although I think on balance they probably are. But I mean, it's hard to trust the US if every 4 years you completely turn around the foreign policy. But the long answer, sorry, Kevin, is to your main point, which is the best way to deal with China would be to get alignment from allies, but recognizing that doesn't get it done. You got to actually get the allies lined up, and that's not happening yet.
What is the biggest geopolitical risk that you see in the next year?
Taiwan and North Korea between the US and China is, to me, the biggest. Also, the potential for climate change problems causing strife in Southeast Asia and South Asia that leads to national security problems. And then you've got questions of stability in some other key countries around the world, but I'd really concentrate on those. I mean, from what I know.
Let's stick with North Korea, because typically every time there's a transition in power in the United States, the North Koreans test missiles or try to provoke to test out the U.S. And if you look at the calendar, historically speaking, we're coming up to that time for the North Koreans. How might the U.S. and a Biden administration be forced to respond to North Korea in a Biden administration's first 100 days?
Like you say, there is a pattern, Kevin, of whoever's in charge in North Korea at a given time picking on the new American president and testing them, and also just saying, hey, pay attention to me. And even if we get a new leader in North Korea, you should expect that. My colleague at Peterson, Marcus Nolan, has written about this. There just isn't that much room for sanctions to directly affect North Korea because of the controls there. You have to try, but any resources they get go to the military elite and go to the party elite. So it's I think what the Biden administration has to do is basically line up with South Korea and Japan to try to say a message to North Korea. No, I'm not looking to exchange love letters with you. We are monitoring you. I don't think there's that much else they can do, but there may be people out there who have better ideas.
Thank you, as always, Adam Posen. The extended conversation there with us for a good 20 minutes. We're so grateful for your time, the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And make sure to stay with us, because on the close today, I guess this is my humble brag, Kevin, Romaine and I are going to be speaking with David Kotok, Cumberland Advisors, 2 p.m., going to get all his thoughts on the markets coming off the record highs that we saw yesterday. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, we get to both share the news of the big news in D.C. that you're following, and then my love, of course, for the markets. And we are getting a report to talk about those markets from Intel. The shares are up almost 6%. This is a report coming from Reuters, but the hedge fund Third Point, led by their CEO, Dan Loeb, urging Intel to explore some deal options, other strategic alternatives. Remember, this is a company that provides chips for companies like Microsoft and Apple, both of whom have said that they're working on creating their own chips in-house to replace Intel. That wasn't good for the company. Competitors like AMD just been on a tear as Intel's been dealing with a lot of delays and some manufacturing problems with their chips. So this is good news for Intel shareholders if indeed hedge fund really pushing for some strategic alternatives here for the company.
Riggs, I feel like our worlds collided this hour with
Perfect
the news
storm.
in D.C. You know, the perfect policy storm. And it's going to be fascinating to see how the developments of the last hour play in the runoff election in Georgia. I can't stress that enough, Taylor, in terms of Senators Perdue and Loeffler going to political battle in Georgia in just a few short days and coming out in favor of these $2,000 checks, despite the move of Leader McConnell to say we're not going to have that vote.
What's the key takeaway from this? Are we going to get a vote in a few days?
I think the key takeaway is that there was a lot of forecasting for the Biden administration that there are Republicans who are willing to have additional economic relief. They're willing to negotiate on that. I was struck by how many Republicans in the House actually came out in favor of that. Taylor, we're going to have to leave it there, but remember that coming up on Balance of Power will continue over on Bloomberg Radio, and I will continue these conversations pertaining to these $2,000 stimulus checks and about the Georgia runoff elections. For Taylor Riggs in New York, I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C., and this is Bloomberg.